This is a pivotal time in the energy transition when your asset managers and your asset owners are making claims like 100% renewable energy. And that's great. And that takes a lot of social capital and license to get to, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But once that's been achieved, my question is, what's next?
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director at Financial Standard, and your guest host for today's episode. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders past, present, and emerging. In a climate summit this year hosted by the Investor Group on Climate Change, or IGCC, one of the panelists spoke about how the growing momentum behind 24/7 carbon-free energy is pretty much the talk of the town. For beginner investment professionals in the room, they were absolutely leaning in. This was a new revelation despite the high-profile advocates of this approach, including Google and Microsoft. So we thought we would invite an expert on this topic who happens to be the chair of the Energy Policy Working Group of the IGCC. Ian Lieblich has worked in climate for over a decade, advising institutional capital, venture funds, and asset managers. Ian, welcome to The Greener Way.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
No worries. So let's start from the very beginning. You have, in fact, written a paper only a couple of years ago on this concept. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and why investors need to know more about this space?
So, as the world transitions to a low carbon and climate resilient economy, one of the most important levers to pull is transitioning the energy sector. So, moving away from traditional forms of electricity generation, so coal and gas, towards renewable forms, wind, solar, hydro, and storage as well. That is a process that globally is underway. And in Australia, we have grown from virtually no renewable energy in our power system a few decades ago to now being at about 40% on an annual basis and are targeting 82% by 2030. And we've reached not necessarily a hurdle in that journey, but we are struggling to overcome somewhat of a shift due to the intermittency of renewable energy. Everybody will remind us, of course, that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. And that intermittency is causing issues, but also creating opportunities as we consider what we'll call the 24-hour cycle of the grid, which in Australia specifically refers to the fact that every day, very reliably, the sun will rise and the sun will set. And the proportion of renewable energy in our grid, due to this high penetration of solar, will go from obviously 0% before sunrise to anywhere between 40, 60, 70% during the middle of the day, before, of course, returning to zero once the sun sets. One of my favorite websites on the internet, OpenNEM, NEM being the national energy market, provides live, up-to-date data of this. It's really fun to track if you're a bit of a nerd like me. But that idea that the carbon intensity of our electricity is constantly changing as renewables and coal and gas enter and exit the grid is a really crucial part of how this transition happens. Now, the mechanisms we have for accounting for the carbon content of our electricity were devised about a decade ago. There's an international metric called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and their Scope 2 guidance is current as of 2015. So that predates the Paris Agreement, that predates the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and virtually every net zero target that corporates and national actors have set since. It's presently being reviewed, and one of the reasons it's being reviewed is because the two mechanisms it allocates for calculating the carbon content of electricity, there is an argument to be made that they're a little bit archaic and no longer fit for purpose. And if you'll give me a moment, I'll explain each in a little bit of detail. Their first mechanism is called the location-based approach, which designates a carbon intensity for any jurisdiction. So in Australia, for example, we're differentiated on a state basis, and the government produces what they call an emissions intensity factor that says that for every kilowatt hour of electricity consumed in, say, New South Wales, that has a carbon content of 0.7 tonnes of carbon. So if you use 100 kilowatts hours of electricity in New South Wales, your carbon footprint is 70. Very simple. The problem with that is that as intermittent sources of renewable energy enter and exit the grid, the carbon content isn't static. It's very dynamic. As I said earlier, energy used during the middle of the day has a carbon content that's about half to a third of the same energy used after sunset. So we are better off using twice as much energy during the middle of the day when the grid is full of solar than we are after the sun has set and that solar is replaced with more gas and coal.
Now, I remember you mentioning that at the panel where you said we should be washing the dishes in the middle of the day, doing our laundry in the middle of the day. And certainly, I like that tip about open NEM. I have a colleague here in the office, and he is obsessed with his solar panels, and he'll talk to me about energy usage. So let me just quickly recap what you just said. And I know that there's a lot to unpack here, but what I'm understanding is we have now moved on from the thinking that kind of was the foundation of our renewable energy store here in Australia. And here we are, and there are alternative ways to think about it, or in fact, perhaps a smarter way to think about it. So please continue, but I didn't want to skip that bit where you did tell people, don't do the dishes at night, do it in the middle of the day.
Yeah, and I agree. It's about sophistication. It's about the aggregation of data. So these government-provided factors account for one data point per year. And on open data sources like OpenNEM, let alone the sort of data that businesses have private access to, you're talking about a data point every 15 minutes. So you are using one approach, which gives you one data point a year, or a different data approach that gives you 35,000 data points a year.
35,000 data points.
I think we know which will be more accurate.
Yes, but please don't make me calculate anymore. I calculate everything from what I'm going to spend on my weekly groceries. But in less than 10 words, tell us, what is 24/7 carbon-free energy, and why should superfund investors care about this as a way to use energy in the future?
I'll tell you in one word.
Ooh, one word.
It's the future. It is how we will track the energy that we use and when we use it. It will how we ensure an equitable and fast transition to more renewable energy.
You're scaring the bejesus out of me. That's such a big leap. So let's get down to the specifics. I mentioned Google and Microsoft. For those who are, like I said, this is kind of a beginner discussion on this topic. Microsoft, one of the most followed tech companies in the world, a lot of money is pouring into Microsoft stock. So what they do from an energy perspective is very important. So they've kind of improved on their energy strategy, or what is the latest?
I'll answer this by referring back to what I was talking about before, and I apologize for scaring the bejesus out of you. But the approach Microsoft and Google and other tech giants are taking is they're taking the greenhouse gas protocols, what they call their market-based approach. And again, they're providing more data, more granularity to get a better understanding of how much renewable energy they're using. So under the market-based approach, any business, and this is what Microsoft have done for years, what Google have done for years, can claim 100% renewable energy status by procuring or acquiring what they call renewable energy certificates. So a certificate which corresponds to a unit of renewable energy used. So if you're Microsoft, or if you're Google, and you use 100 units of energy, you acquire 100 renewable energy certificates, and hey, we're 100% renewable. The problem with this is, like I said before, with the 24-hour cycle of the grid, these businesses might be using renewable energy at 9 p.m., at 10 p.m., which is predominantly fossil fuel, and pairing that with a renewable energy certificate generated in the middle of the day, maybe 6 hours earlier, maybe 6 months earlier, and thus making a 100% renewable energy claim. And that's what Microsoft engineers and Google's engineers understood what was happening and effectively challenged their internal commitments and their internal targets, saying, hey, we don't think this is an accurate, we don't think this is a transparent representation of how much renewable energy we're truly using. So what they've done and how they're leading the way is, instead of matching total renewable energy use, say on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis, They're understanding that 24-hour cycle of the grid, and they're matching or trying to match renewable energy supply to demand every 30 minutes or every hour, which is to say that if you're using energy at 8 p.m., you can't use a solar renewable energy certificate because there is no solar at 8 p.m.
Yes, that doesn't make sense.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense. I know it's a sort of a beginner's chat, but if you think about it for a second, if businesses will say, we're 100% renewable and all our energy is coming from this solar farm, you're thinking, well, you've probably got to have a lot of batteries, or what do you do when it's cloudy? So this more granularity of data is why Google now report their renewable energy proportion not as 100%, but as 61% or 64% or 27% or 73%, depending the jurisdiction and depending the day. And that is what 24/7 carbon-free energy means. It means moving away from a monthly or an annual 100% renewable energy target to understanding, as the name suggests, and being engineers, they have a lot of creativity when it comes to naming these things, 24/7 carbon-free energy. Every hour of every day, how much energy are we using? Are we able to match that to solar, hydro, wind, even nuclear? We won't go down that rabbit hole, but the tech companies are starting to reinvest in nuclear as well as another source of carbon-free energy.
Yes, no rabbit holes today, but certainly that is another big topic to discuss. So we've talked about the benefits and the opportunities there, but what is the downside? Are there any downside? What are the constraints? Do we need more government legislation on this? Is it expensive? Tell us more.
Sure. So let me just reiterate one of the opportunities as well. And that's, we talked about this at the conference, but it's the demand side management. We talked about this when we said, you should be running dishwashers and washing machines during the middle of the day. Because if we change our behaviors to shift our energy use to when renewable energy is most abundant, that's the best way to ease the transition. That limits what they call curtailing of solar, when you have to shut solar off, because it creates demand when renewable energy supply is at its highest. Sort of basic market economics. You want to match supply to demand. So if you have businesses like Microsoft and Google using less energy at 8 p.m., using more energy at midday, that will ease the transition and creates economic opportunity. One of the limitations is when you're managing a data center with the growth in energy demand from cloud computing and AI, it's hard to shift demand. People use the internet at 8 p.m., so Google and Microsoft and these businesses are somewhat limited by just how much they can manage their load and shift their demand from 8 p.m. to midday. So I would say that's one of the greatest challenges that these leading businesses are facing.
Don't hire insomniacs. That's what I'm going to say. No one works after 8 p.m. Let's just all go home and have 8 hours of sleep. Now, levity aside, for super funds listening to this episode, what are the resources available in the market right now to know more about the progress in this space? And again, you have been in this community for over a decade. Are super funds taking this seriously, or are we truly at the very start of the journey?
We're at the beginning. The first movers have been the tech giants, and at the other end of the spectrum, startups who are providing technical solutions. For super funds, there is plenty of emerging literature out there. Google have pioneered a lot. They even have a policy guide. The Climate Group, who oversee the RE100 standard, the Renewable Energy 100 standard, they've just launched a 24/7 carbon-free standard. There's a lot of great literature around what that means there. That happened about a month ago. My message to super funds, and this is again what I shared at the panel, would be this. This is a pivotal time in the energy transition when your asset managers and your asset owners are making claims like 100% renewable energy. And that's great. And that takes a lot of social capital and license to get to, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But once that's been achieved, my question is, what's next? Is that the answer? Once companies reach 100% renewable energy, has the climate crisis been solved? Or is there room for greater ambition, greater leadership, capable of accelerating the transition of the grid and these economies? And as you can probably guess, my answer to that question is yes. And then the next question is, what does leadership look like? To me, it's this. It's a commitment to time-matched 24/7 carbon-free energy.
Well said, Ian. Now, I have 30,000 more questions to ask, But this episode is truly just for enough time while someone is washing the dishes or doing a couple of chores around the house. But we would love to invite you back again to just unpack other things that you've mentioned today about alternative uses of energy. And certainly, we're always watching at how super funds are engaging with fund managers on this topic. So once again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle. Always happy to chat.
Thank you all for listening to this episode where we unpack, it's a very beginner level discussion on 24/7 carbon-free energy. I'm Michelle Baltazar, and thanks for listening to The Greener Way.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.